All right. Hey, that's 11 or 6 or 3, wherever you are. Hello, Jeff. Are you with me?
Yeah, I was muted.
Yep.
I was just saying, are we all right? But good that the internet's back and we are all
Yeah.
right.
Maybe some little internet difficulties, but we're gonna try and do this. So yeah. So how have you been, Jeff?
Well, some days you just wake up on the wrong side of the bed and you feel like your body just won't react to what your brain is telling it to do.
Is
And today is one of those days.
is that one of those days that young people don't know about, but when we
Yeah.
have kids and once you've joined the panel of parental advisory, you know what you're talking about. Is it one of those things?
It could be. If you don't know what I'm talking about, then yeah, it could be then. Um, yeah, because the problem did start once I became a dad. Well, yeah. It kind of just hits you one day, you know? One
Yeah.
day you're full of life and vitality. You're
And next day you're a
playing with your kid
dad.
all day. Yeah.
Yeah. No, we're pro kids, so it's a wonderful feeling. That feeling, whatever it is you're describing, I'm sure it's a wonderful feeling.
Yeah.
And if you're a dad,
My cousin,
Ooh.
my cousin, mother of three, always sighs and then goes, but it's a joy.
I have a theory that like it's after number 3 that they start to kind of look after themselves. That a lot of people
Yeah.
just stop at 3, but at the point you've got 4, number 1 is looking after number 4. And so it kind of is like, well, whatever, 4, sure, 5, 6, who can tell the difference? So what you just got to get over that 3. Not that I'm a dad, but that's my theory. Once you get to 4, it's like whatever. That's my theory.
I got a long way to go then.
Oh yeah. Anyway, if you are a dad or if you're not a dad, welcome. And we've got a little distraction for you from raising kids. Oh, and I've deleted the title card somehow. Somewhere along the way, I've deleted the title card. This is episode 4 of our little Tragedy and Hope series. We're doing chapter 5 and 6 of Tragedy and Hope, which is about the First World War and Versailles. And so, oh, 1 second. I think has it. There's some sort of delay with my thing. So, a little recap. Something is I'm having. Are you seeing this on? There we go.
I see the slide.
You see it changing. There's a
I
little
see.
bit of a
I
lag.
see recap. Oh,
Okay.
okay, yeah, yeah, it is.
So this is the recap. Russia is schizo. We talked a bit about that. Go watch the shorts if you want a little reminder of that. It's all over the place. Very confused system of trying to combine polar opposites without any sort of middle ground between them, which is going to create a volatile situation, which you see in Russia. Turkey is weak. It's all over the place. Spread very thin. Very dependent upon sitting on top of the Arabs, keeping the Arabs in line. It's lost its sort of authority as the leader of Islam. And this process of the First World War is going to bring the Ottoman Empire to an end, and we'll see a little bit about that. China is weak. I'm worried that there's a significant amount of lag here between it showing up, because it's not showing up on my on my thing.
So even on your screen, it's not showing up.
It is on my slideshow, but it's not on OBS.
Ah, I see. Could it be some kind of frame rate thing or refresh rate setting?
I don't know. It doesn't seem to be. There we go. Well, there it is. China's weak. It seems to be very delayed. Shall I? Sorry, 1 second.
Now what did you do?
I've just taken it down, and now I'm going to bring it back up. And hopefully this should go a little bit smoother. It looks like it. Yeah, Russia is schizo. Sorry for this, guys. Turkey is weak. China is weak. A lot of people are weak. A lot of people weak.
By the way, for all of the offensive things we might have said about the various different buffer nations last week, in the comments section, the most rustled people were the Russians.
I saw
Nobody said anything about India. No, you saw that, okay.
Yeah. I think I saw one guy complaining on the shorts about the characterization of Russia. I didn't characterize anybody in a way that Quigley doesn't characterize them, except for India. That there was a bit of me in India. So don't blame Quigley for India, but you can blame him for everything else. Britain is everywhere, but they're dealing with tantrums. Oh, you can see this a little bit. They're dealing with tantrums for people they're helping, who should be grateful. So you see that, and Japan's the bright spot. Japan is doing really well. Japan, if it hadn't had the U.S. To come butt up against in the 30s, Japan would probably be one of them, like the second or third most powerful nation on Earth right now. If the Pacific had been a bit bigger, if the U.S. hadn't been in the Philippines. Japan is a remarkable country in the way that it comes out so quickly out of its isolation, and is really able to take off. And it did remarkably well in the post-war. There's a incredibly interesting documentary about Japan's economy over the last 20 or 30 years. Is it Masters of the Yen or Princes of the Yen? Jeff, you know the one I'm talking about. I highly recommend that. It's really interesting. And basically what international finance will do to you to break you and make you part of the system, because that's what they did to Japan. Japan's a remarkable country, very interesting, very powerful, uniquely united around a particular vision. The Japanese are very prepared to make sacrifices for their nation in a way that few, if any, other countries are able to do. So, Japan's interesting. Today, we're looking at chapters 5 and 6, the First World War, the system it brings, all these. You'll see the sort of the changes in this international system that come with it. The processes it accelerates. Quigley says that the First World War doesn't bring anything new, but it does speed up things. And he says what would have taken 30 or 40 or 50 years, he says like 30 to 50 years is the time frame. Instead of things happening over 30 or 50 years, it happens over 5 years. and how it also sets up the Second World War. We're going to see that, and what we're going to see is some of the pieces that we put out there in the first 3 episodes starting to come together. There's payoff from those 3 episodes a bit here. Really going to happen next episode. The next episode's a big one. I mentioned in one of the episodes that I have these little stars next to significant chapters, and I have a big star next to chapter 7 because it's really interesting and really important for Quigley's sort of view of the world. But we're going to do it in 2 parts. We're going to look at the First World War itself, and then we're going to look at Versailles. And actually, I'm not going to give you too much about the First World War itself, but the wartime period, because you can get a lot of this stuff from other places. Quigley doesn't have a particularly good. I have this in a later slide. Quigley doesn't have a particularly interesting military history of the First World War or of the diplomatic side of the First World War. But yeah, and I may have put this in last time, but there are these 9 crises that sort of lead up to the war, and some of the history's forgotten a lot of these. We remember the Agadir crisis, which is on here, but there's all these issues about Morocco, and so I'm just going to go through these really quickly. And I can't even remember what some of these are. But it's sort of like the first Moroccan crisis is like the extent to which something to do with like French and German participation in Morocco as Spanish influence over it starts to decline. Bosnia, right? Bosnia is an issue. The Balkans are an issue. And of course, an issue in the Balkans is going to be what starts it off. But there's this little Bosnian conflict. Agadir, which is the second Moroccan crisis, the Tripolitan War, which is a war between Italy and this like Ottoman protectorate, and Italy kind of makes this grab, sort of unauthorized grab, and seizes some land in Tunisia. The First Balkan War. There's all these wars before the First World War in the Balkans in like this 4 or 5 year period that people forget about. First Balkan War, Second Balkan War. There's an Albanian crisis. I don't remember that. Lehman von Sanders affair, which is very interesting because with the conference we talked about, the Berlin conference last time, Turkey's very grateful to Germany because Germany is the only power that doesn't take anything from Turkey. Lehman von Sanders was a German officer who went to Turkey and became the head of their army. The very common thing for non-Western powers to do is to, even today, is to hire British officers to go and fill in like their and tell them what to do at these very strategic levels. This is what the Turks were doing. They brought in this guy Lehman von Sanders, and it was thought that it was felt by a number of people that this was sort of not right, that this was a violation of that this was precipitating a war because it was sort of going to bring Turkey into the sphere of influence of Germany, things like that. And Turkey already kind of was. There's the Baghdad to Berlin Railway. We saw that last time a little bit. And then Sarajevo. And Sarajevo is the big one. Sarajevo is where Princeps assassinates Archduke Ferdinand and his wife. And we're off. We're off to the ball game. And it's just, and I didn't actually put a side into this about this. There's this process of sort of snowballing that happens after Sarajevo, where it's like no one's quite sure that the war is actually going to begin, and in fact, at certain points, it looks like we're all right, but it's sort of this slow momentum building up, and somebody does something else, and is Germany guilty for this? Is it not guilty for this? I'll talk about that in a second. There is a sign. So they've been through 9 crises, and there's a belief that everything's sort of worked out. It'll work out again. There's nothing to worry about, and yeah, it'll work out. But there's also this weird idea that there's going to be a war, and depending upon who you are, it's preferable that it happens sooner rather than later. The Germans are worried about Russia's building of railways, because the quicker Russia can get its army to the front, the more under pressure Germany's going to be. So the sooner the war starts, the less railways Russia has built. And the von Schlieffen plan that the Germans have is, we're going to knock out France as quickly as possible, and then we're going to force France to the negotiating table really quickly, like we did in 1870 in the Franco-Prussian War, and then we're going to turn and destroy the Russians. Incidentally, it happens the other way around. They get bogged down in France. They realize they're bogged down in France, and the tougher fight is on the Western Front, and they siphon troops off from the Western Front, send them to the East, have some amazing victories over the Russians. The Battle of Tannenberg is this like amazing victory. Just destroy entire armies of the Russians, and knock the Russians out of the war, and then turn back west. So it's quite interesting. But yeah, that's the idea that a lot of people have. Like, well, and the British are sort of worried about the Germans building of their navy, which is, Germany builds a navy. And their intention was, if we have this big navy, we can bring the Brits to the negotiating table and get them to leave us alone. It's sort of like us sort of saying to the Brits, like, look, we've got a navy, we can sort of see you off to an extent, so don't get involved, because we can deal with you. This just annoys the British, because the British love their navy. We've sort of forgotten a bit about it, but the British Navy is an incredibly important institution. And we know that academically, but emotionally, we've sort of forgotten that. And we forgot that in the Second World War, when air power became so significant. And the Germans can't bring troops across because we still control the waters, but they can bomb our cities. And the Second World War is a wake-up to the British that the Royal Navy's not enough, and all of a sudden this incredible natural barrier in the Channel is kind of negated. What's
very interesting about this is it seems like on the surface it seems like a race to build transportation infrastructure.
Yeah.
Underneath that, it's actually an arms race.
I think it's the other way around. I think it's an arms race and underneath it is this infrastructure race. I have so one of the things I talked about in the first episode was sort of Quigley's view of history, and this is a good example of it. It's the longue durée. The First World War, in and of itself, the battles don't matter. These are trends that were happening. So to talk about the diplomatic side, I won't talk much about the military history. I will say this though, the way things sort of snowball, and there's a lot of debate. And after Versailles, the Germans sign this, and it's quite interesting what happens. But we'll get to that. But the Germans signed the war guilt clause, and this then gets to be a point of contention. Like, we're not entirely guilty. Everyone's a bit to blame. There's been recent evidence, though, that kind of vindicates the war guilt putting it on Germany, because the telegrams that we have of the Germans communicating with their embassy staffs is pretty much like, yeah, start a war. The Kaiser, like, in 1914, the Kaiser wanted a war. The Kaiser has quite a bit of control, more control than the British king does at the time, or I don't know what the Russian Tsar, the level of power the Russian Tsar has. I assume similar to the Kaiser, but the Germans really wanted a war. All the powers on the East kind of wanted a war. The Russians were like, this is our chance. The Germans saw it as their chance. The Austro-Hungarians, it was their chance to pounce on Serbia. France doesn't want a war. I think I can say that pretty categorically. The British really don't want a war. The British are merchants. Time and time again, the story of British history is like British trade and merchants showing up, and like in order to protect that trade, finding themselves in a war. That's how we got India. We showed up and just sort of like accrued this process of like trade agreements, and then a war breaks out and starts to disrupt our trade, and we stop it and make alliances. And so the British, I think, are aware intellectually that the war is going to be very damaging, but there are still crowds throughout all the capital cities that are incredibly happy with the outbreak of war. There's another side to it, though, and Peter Hitchens references this. I can't remember the guy's name at the time. He's an Austrian Jewish writer, and he wrote a number of books about, and he lived at the time, and he said, people were not happy. The soldiers marching through the streets. Maybe the professional soldiers were happy. Maybe the urban populations were happy, but when reservists and draftees were called up and they're marching through the streets of their local towns, their wives were crying. They're crying. It's not a very happy affair. But so things start to snowball, and you can blame people for it and say this side's responsible, that side's responsible. My view of it has changed in the past couple of months into this very pragmatic, real sort of view, which was there were rising powers in Europe, and the status quo was no longer adequate, and in this very brutal way, Europe just had to fight to see what the new order was going to be. It's not nice, but it's just how politics is.
And were the upper class people happy because they saw an opportunity to profit off of it without risking their own lives?
I don't know. I've never read anything about that. I wouldn't be surprised. There's the famous quote by the foreign minister for Britain, foreign secretary, and he says he was standing at the window and his aide was there, someone was there, and he said, the lights are going out throughout Europe, and I fear that they will not be relit in my lifetime. So there were people who realized this was a disaster, that they were headed to a disaster, and we'll see this later. They never recaptured the pre-war period, and the guys that saw this knew that this was going to be a disaster. Now back to Quigley's idea, 5 years versus 50 years. Had these systems broken down over 50 years, would it have been, and the new systems emerged, would it have been better? Maybe having these systems break down over 5 years and be very quickly replaced, maybe that actually was better. I don't know. Who knows? It's a counterfactual. But the lights were already dimming, right? A lot of these, and I this guy was speaking politically and diplomatically. I'm talking about everything when I say it. That economics, politics, diplomacy, everything. Social, which is a big thing, which is what a good segue. I'll say this: the Middle East is the real issue in diplomacy. What are we going to do with all this stuff? How, the division of, it's not super important here. Tragedy and Hope ends before, Americans are on the ground in Iraq and things like that. There's maybe a bit about Israel towards the end. I don't remember at this point. So, but in terms of diplomatic wrangling in the First World War, the Middle East is the real issue. And just on diplomacy, it's important to note the difference between British and French strategic approaches. The French want a unified command in France, which means that British soldiers are placed under the direction of French generals. Because, of course, the French have the biggest army in France by magnitudes, and the British are very reluctant. They don't want this. And so the British are sort of saying, like, always demurring from giving French generals command of British troops. I don't know why, if the idea is that the French are going to treat it like a meat grinder. I don't know that the French are any worse than the British at treating their soldiers as disposable. What the French want to do is beat the Germans in France. The British, which is always the way that we do things, the British is death by 1,000 cuts. The British want to open up a front here. The British want to open up a front there. Because they know with their navy, they can keep the Germans off balance. And so for every troop that... It acts as a force multiplier. Because the British can put 3 troops here, which forces the Germans to put 5 troops there. And it starts to negate the Germans' advantage in manpower. So that's the big difference, and there's diplomatic chafing between the British and French over this. Quigley doesn't really deal much about Russia in this chapter. He will in subsequent chapters about the rise of the Soviet Union out of the First World War, but that's for a future episode. The home front is the real issue, and it's a really important part of Tragedy and Hope. And it's the bit that I'm going to talk about today in terms of the First World War. As I said, don't need to know a lot about the military history. If you want the military history and the diplomatic history, you can find people that do it much better than Quigley. But Quigley puts the home front in this context of the system, which is what we're interested in, right? Jeff and I are circling this thing about control and society and technology and technocracy and managerialism, and you really see this with on the home front that you don't see in the military history. So
basically why all of these things seem to converge at one endpoint, which is this technocratic, AI controlled, algorithmically run world.
And the beginning of it's the First World War. The beginning of the process of the First World War. So it's incredibly ruinous in terms of the amount of money spent. The British spend, at a time when this is a lot more money than it is now, in one battle, the British spend £22 million on artillery shells. The French and British at Verdun and the Somme have a combined casualty in those two battles of 1.7 million people. Do you know what the population of Vancouver is, Jeff?
It's probably about that, yeah.
So imagine like all of Vancouver, and I think the ratio is about for when you hear casualties is about 1/3 die, 2/3 wounds, and I think again like maybe half. So it's I think roughly. If anyone knows better, say so in the comments. But I think it's about 1/3 dead, 1/3 wounded for life, and 1/3 out of action. So imagine 600,000 Vancouverites dead. 1 in 3 Vancouverites dead, just off the street tomorrow. It's an amazing sum, but
those numbers are unheard of today. Today, there's
No.
a dozen American soldiers die, and it's front page news.
Yeah, but these empires are so committed. This is the first total war, and back to that thing about the British opening up multiple fronts. The British are able, because of the Navy, the British are always able to define their exposure to a war. So the British can say, we are prepared to put, and this is the example Quigley uses, right? We can put 50,000 troops on the continent in a war with Germany. France doesn't have that ability. France has to say, it's all or nothing. We are fighting for our survival in this war. But whenever Britain shows up to a European war, it can always go, we're going to limit our exposure. Britain realizes with this war, there's no limiting exposure. Yeah, we can limit exposure in certain ways, but we're all in. So it's incredibly costly. And as I said, it doesn't do anything new. It just speeds things up. And here's a great example. The gold standard is essentially destroyed. Gold was dying in 1913, according to Quigley. The war gives the excuse to destroy the gold standard. If not outright, it does so de facto. They suspend the gold standard. What it means is money can be printed, the economy goes into overdrive, and with that goes inflation. And there's inflation all over the place because you need things like cotton to make explosives. But you're paying more money to laborers to make the explosives, who now have more money to spend on cotton shirts. And so they're prepared to spend more for a cotton shirt, which you need for the explosives. And what that does is it gives the government the excuse to step in and take away this automatic control. And so basically capitalism dies. The golden age of capitalism dies. It doesn't come back. We haven't had anything like the capitalism that we had of 1913 since. So there's a big change here, and the loss of automatic control in the First World War, it's across everywhere. But I mean, just staying broad, and it's the beginning of managerialism, because you now have civil servants allocating resources. They're making decisions about what is the value of a linen bandage, and how many linen bandages should we make, and how else should we use that linen. It's not based upon the market. It's based upon these other considerations that they're worried about.
But this was one of those things that you say was going to happen inevitably anyway, right?
I think by that I meant the gold standard. The gold standard was going to get destroyed. Okay. And with it, though, I think managerialism would have come in. It wouldn't have roared in the same way that it does, because it wouldn't have had to make these like wartime decisions. And this is the thing: is what happens is in areas like wool, cotton, fuel, steel, you are no longer operating by the profit motive. You're now because there's a concern that is now above the profit motive, which is winning the war. And as a result, I mean, what comes out of this on the other side is inflation in countries that don't have any control, the losers. And so you get countries like Germany, Poland, Hungary, Russia, and they have everyone who has savings, okay, the middle class, gets destroyed. The working class does okay because the working class is making stuff in factories. The upper class does okay because they own the capital. Middle class, white collar people who have savings, they don't have skills, manual skills, and they don't own the means of production, are destroyed. And I'll give you one guess which way disgruntled white collar workers voted in the 1930s in Germany. They didn't vote for the Social Democrats, okay? They didn't vote for the communists. They didn't vote for the guys who lost the war, the conservatives. They voted for an Austrian artist. So, and that happened, but that's also why, you know, you can see like in Russia, I assume, I don't know the details about this, but that they maybe become more embracing of the Soviets. But there's a lot of resentment to the working class because the working class that don't go to war do really well. The one group that doesn't get a pay rise out of the war are the guys in the trenches. They don't get. It's a fairly like altruistic thing that they do. Like they're not even getting paid. Meanwhile, if you know how to make a cannon, I'm not going to send you to war. You're going to stay right where you are in a London suburb, and I'm going to give you a pay rise. So, and where does this not happen? It doesn't happen in the UK or the US. Italy and France are a bit in the middle. A lot of French wealth gets destroyed. A lot of French wealth. Quigley talks about $400 billion, it might be pounds, worth of French or damages occurring on French soil at a time when all property in France was worth $75 billion. So multiples of the French economy is worth of damage happens in France. And one of the other things you see out of this is the rise of the labor unions, because all these guys working in, if you know the football team Arsenal, they're named Arsenal because they play at the Arsenal, right? Like they're in that neighborhood, and the Arsenal, Woolwich Arsenal, is where the British made their guns. And if you're working in the Woolwich Arsenal, the government's dependent upon you. And the government walks this fine line between like making laws about striking and unions, but also knowing it can't be all stick. They've got to use some carrot. Do you want to? But there's something that does more damage than anything else. It's a huge thing. It changes everything. Do you want to guess what it is, Jeff?
No idea.
On the home front.
Any hints?
Your
chat.
You can't.
Any guesses from chat?
Yeah. Go on. Any guesses from chat?
Right. I think the Jeopardy song just ended.
Let me put it this way, Jeff. You can't live with them. You can't live without them.
Women in the workforce.
Oh! And they are everywhere. And it changes everything about the way that the gender relations exist. They're working in factories. They're working on farms. And out of this, after the end of the war, they go, give us the vote, because we've seen like what we can do. The way that they dress changes. Their way that they behave in public changes. They're no longer the expectation. They're no longer willing to put up with this demure, womanly, feminine demeanor. They're more assertive. They're more aggressive. It changes everything, and it's socially, as far as I'm concerned, the most damaging thing that happens. Anything else we could have dealt with, but this socially undermines everything. It ruins everything. So
No more wives submitting to their husbands. Egalitarianism, right? So,
if not in the way that we have to deal with now, the beginnings of it, the beginnings of that trajectory. But again, it didn't cause it. It just sped it up, because you got idiots like J.S. Mill, who dies before the First World War begins. John Stuart Mill, right, the utilitarian, and he's sort of, go on, you should be involved, women. Gavin McInnes has this bit that's quite good about. I love Gavin McInnes, and I reference him a lot in conversation. Some of the things I don't agree with, but he's funny, and he's got a good take on this. And he's like, the problem is that you have men encouraging women to like get involved. Like no women in like 1840 is really like wants to vote. It takes like guys like John Stuart Mill showing up, being like, "Come on, you're a smart broad. You should get up there. Go on, go on." So like, I don't hope John Stuart Mill is suffering. I hope he realizes his mistake. So, and I can't wait to get Laurentian's comment on this. A big thing that happens economically is around agriculture. The value of food goes up because Europe is not able to produce food. Germany's cut off from its nitrogen, so German soil is depleted for like 20 years. They're not able to put nitrogen into the soil. What nitrogen they can get is being used for explosives. So you have a boom in places like the U.S., Canada, Australia, and South America in terms of the value of farming. Canada goes from in wheat production goes from 9.9 million acres of under cultivation for wheat to 22.1. Its global share of wheat goes from 14% to 39%. So this is not good land. This is land that really shouldn't be farmed, but it's able to be farmed because of the price of wheat, the price of food, and the new technology and chemicals that are coming out. And things get really bad in Germany around food production. As I said, nitrogen depletion. Around in 1930, a German chemist named Haber figures out a way to extract nitrogen from the air. That's a huge thing. It's a big thing. Up until then, countries, in order to get nitrogen, they got to do a couple of things. They can either do crop rotation, planting legumes, or they import nitrogen from Chile, which has a lot of it from the mountains and mountains and mountains of bird poop. So but of course Germany is cut off from Chile, so German food production plummets. It depletes the soil, and incredibly tragic. And you kind of start to feel not a lot of love for the Allies, and the British in particular. Right, the armistice happens in November of 1918. The blockade continues for 8 months to force the Germans to negotiate in the spring and summer of 1919. There's estimates that maybe 800,000 Germans died in those 9 months from starvation, because the blockades were like being used as leverage against them. The Germans are starving to death at the end of the war. That's really no exaggeration. One of the things that happens is in the spring of 1918 is the Ludendorff offensive, which breaks through, and it's kind of like this miracle. I don't remember the details. Don't ask me the details. But these German troops break through And the Ludendorff offensive only has one breakthrough because the troops get to the Allied food and they just start eating. Because they don't give a shit about the war. They were as much fighting to get at the food behind enemy lines. There's stories about German soldiers drinking themselves to death off of captured British rum. It's quite. Now, had they been able to exploit that, who knows what would have happened? But by then, America was there and things like that. And the other thing is, I clicked it a little bit earlier than I wanted to. I wasn't sure if there was another. I wasn't sure if there was another slide there. Oh, I'll say one other thing about that: the economic sort of and the agricultural. It destroys the system that Central Europe has. There are 2 or 3 big powers in Central Europe, maybe 4. You want to say like maybe Italy, Russia's there, Germany, Austro-Hungary, maybe some Balkan countries. That system's gone. And as I say, by 1930, the German agricultural land is still not productive because of nitrogen depletion. So Central Europe's destroyed in many ways, which we'll come back to in a minute. The big thing on the political side is the centralization. What I've called, I'm sure someone else has used this, but I've called it democratic authoritarianism, where these democracies like France and Britain are able to do things in war that they would never be allowed to do at any other time. They centralize incredibly, not just in what the governments do, but in the governments themselves. Lloyd George is basically a one-man government. Clemenceau is basically a one-man government, and so is Ludendorff in Germany. They bring in censorship. They bring in propaganda. Apparently, the British are the best at propaganda. And Quigley says, by the end of the war, the British like propagandists were believing their own propaganda, like about Germans doing this or that, and vice versa. The Germans saying, the Russians are subhuman monsters. Why does that sound familiar? It's total war. And in order to justify total war, you need to make yourself totally into the good guys and your opponents into totally the bad guys. There's no redeeming qualities to Germans. You've got to kill them. It doesn't matter. And you can see that happening in Ukraine right now. The way that the way the West wants to make itself out to be the good guy. I'm not commenting on the ethics of the war in Ukraine, but the portrayal of Russians and Russian soldiers and what Russian soldiers deserve by not even Ukrainian sources, but sources in Western liberal democracies is pretty shocking. And it's very similar to this. It's very similar to the dehumanization that begins with the First World War and gets carried on. There's nothing new about the dehumanization of various groups that happens in the Second World War, because it's what they did in the First World War.
Anecdotally, when the current war started in Ukraine, a number of Orthodox churches in my city, Vancouver, got vandalized. So it's kind of like the amount of fervor that this kind of propaganda can kick up is pretty amazing.
Yeah. There's an interesting little thing here. The last thing I want to say about this is just on that propaganda. The British know how valuable propaganda is going to be in a way that the others don't. And the British have a special department called the American Bureau of Information, which is an information channel that's going to control and guide the information that Americans get about the war happening in Europe. This is not a new thing, but it's an interesting thing. We're going to talk more about this in future episodes. The British, before the First World War, know they need America. The question is, how are they going to get America involved? How are they? Because they're involved on this great civilizing mission. The world would be better with English institutions everywhere. The world would be better if everyone had a little bit of English sort of culture to them, constitutionally, legally, property rights, economics, that sort of stuff. And this stuff needs to get spread amongst a view of a certain group of British people. And these guys are known as the Milner Group. And
here we go.
The Milner Group is funded by Cecil Rhodes at the beginning, before Rhodes dies. And actually they control a lot of his estate after he dies. But the Milner Group has a view, and Rhodes shares this, that we need to bring America into the empire. We need that strength in the empire, not cooperating, in the empire. And then they realize that's not going to happen. So what do? And I want you to think about where we are in 2023. I want you to think about countries like Canada, Australia, New Zealand to an extent. New Zealand's interesting. Britain, certainly. All the ex-British colonies to an extent. How do we make the empire part of America? And the American Bureau of Information is I don't know much about it, but it's just an interesting little footnote in that story of bringing the empire into America. But they know the view of how do we make the empire part of America is before the First World War. It's before the Second World War, right? Remarkable that these guys are talking about this at the height of the British Empire. They can see where things are headed, and they want to federate. And I really want to just talk about this for the next 3 hours, but I'm gonna kind of cut it off there unless Jess has a specific question, or the chat has a specific question, because it's so deep. It's such a big topic. It deserves like 4 or 5 episodes to its own. But yeah, unless you have.
There's a great documentary by James Corbett about the Milner Group that
Okay.
people can check out if they want to learn more.
I didn't know about it.
To what degree do you think that they just had incredible foresight versus they caused some of these things that they predicted to happen?
I want to say both. I want to say they made a self-fulfilling prophecy. They saw something, and then they pushed it. They are these like well-meaning lefties who did all this stuff that ended up destroying the empire, yeah, I think I want the conservative answer is I think they saw something, and the way that they acted made it more likely. So the self-fulfilling prophecy. Now, if you leave it there, if you leave it where Quigley leaves it, that's what it is. I want to take it further. But taking it further means looking into their religion. And I'm reluctant to talk about it because it's something that I'm developing. But there's a weird thing about the religion of all these guys in the Milner Group. They're not Anglicans. They're not Catholics. They're certainly not Orthodox. They're from nonconformist backgrounds, and they end up in pretty heretical denominations. Heretical by the definition of the Nicene creeds, right?
Yeah.
If you're Orthodox, you know, if you're a generous Orthodox, you'll say about the Anglicans that, you know, at least believing Anglicans are creedal. The Catholics are creedal. The groups that the Milner group ends up in are non-creedal, and what's the most dangerous thing in terms of heresy, right? Putting aside the differences between creedal Christians, well, the most damaging thing is the thing that comes as close to the truth as it possibly can, but diverges just at the right point. And so, for a creedal Christian, a Muslim is not a threat in the way that a non-creedal Christian is a threat. So, I kind of want to go down that occult road, that road, and say there's something going on there. I don't know what. They didn't write anything, but Lionel Curtis, who is a big member of it and one of the most important members of it. So Milner unifies South Africa. He unifies these colonies, the South African colonies, into a federated country. And well, that's an interesting little event, isn't it? Yeah. But then they go, this is what we're going to do to the empire. We're going to use the empire as a model for federation. And then when that doesn't work out, what they say is, we're going to use the South African model that we developed, federating, into federating the world. And so a one world government view comes out of the Milner Group and what it does in South Africa before the First World War. So the federation of South Africa happens before the First World War, not whether or not there's a view of like, and federating the empire is before the First World War. The federating the globe is post First World War. At least I haven't seen anything that says anyone talking about it before the First World War, because the First World War gives justification to it. And this isn't Quigley, I don't think. I can't remember where I read this, but I was reading something and it said, maybe it was Quigley. I don't remember exactly. I can't remember where I saw this. It was like the last 3 days I saw this. Where do you want to look? This is breaking, guys. This is the juiciest tidbit I can give you going forward, and this is your canary in the coal mine for one world government. When Australia and New Zealand unite into a single country, we're off to the races. That is the beginning of the effort to federate into a one world government. Should that happen, that's the first thing that's going to happen, apparently. I like it. I like it as an idea because it's not far-fetched. It's a very plausible thing. The Australian Constitution has room for New Zealand to plug right into it. That effort to federate the globe is going to start with British colonies. And it makes me all of a sudden not be too keen on Kanzuk. And I love Kanzuk. I love the idea of it. But if Kanzuk is going to lead us down the road to one world government, that's how it's going to happen. Because then they're going to say, well, look how well it's happening in Australia and New Zealand. Britain and Canada should join. And then it's going to be, well, why not America? And well, if it's America, it's NAFTA. And well, why not just South America? And Europe is also kind of, tied into Britain. And before you know it, the dominoes will fall. I don't know. I liked it, but that's a juicy little tidbit. Watch for Australia and New Zealand. We've drifted very far from the First World War, but this is what it's building to. There's a system and the people sitting at the control desk, and the people sitting at the control desk are a group that started with the Milner Group. So and we're going to come back to the Milner Group, but that's how it sort of gets going. We're coming up on an hour, and I want to get through the next bit. Do you have any questions before I go on? Any more comments? Anything from the chat? This is a good point to look at with the chat, if there is anything.
Well, Hello says, aren't Australia and New Zealand already in lockstep? A signal would be a formal union? Question mark.
Yeah. They're not one country. They have sort of shared agreements. They have freedom of movement between their populations. They have cooperation. New Zealand has no air force to speak of. They've got a decent special forces. They've got maybe one infantry regiment. They've got a few boats, but they've no fighter jets. They pissed America off because in the 70s or 80s, the Green Movement was quite significant in New Zealand, and they said no nuclear material can enter into New Zealand waters. And America said, okay, that then negates our obligation to protect you under these treaties, because a big part of our defense contingent is nuclear-powered aircraft carriers and submarines, and we're not going to protect you. There's the sinking of the Greenpeace sort of finds a bit of a shelter in New Zealand, and French special forces go down to New Zealand and sink this Greenpeace boat, and like one or two people die. What am I talking? I'm going off on New Zealand, but yeah, New Zealand's interesting. But so they're kind of, New Zealand's dependent upon Australia. There's an aspect to this which I haven't talked about yet, which is if you look at the Anglosphere and divide it up and look at like reasonable claims on Antarctica, the Anglosphere controls a huge part of Antarctica. There are overlapping claims, but like when you take the 5 Anglo countries, a lot of that is that's ours practically.
Well, this idea of lockstep is really interesting. You tend to see this words like lockstep in a lot of globalist, type of documents, right?
So if you get them,
basically,
go on. Sorry, I thought you were
another word for lockstep is kind of standardization.
Yeah, exactly. That's what I was going to say.
Yeah, and so standardization is this kind of gateway for different countries to eventually say, we're not so different from this country. And we can increasingly kind of get closer and closer with these unions until it becomes a formal union.
And it is with the Milner Group that, as far as I can tell, is the first group that uses the concept of ever closer union. I don't see it anywhere else. And what they're talking about is the empire. What happens is, one of the things that destroys the potential for imperial federation, there's an imperial federation movement before the war and an imperial federation movement after the war. And the Canadian, New Zealand, and Australian contingents show up to Versailles and places like that and realize it's better for us to get all the benefits of being part of the empire but be independent dominions than it is for us to federate and have some sort of like oversight from London. And it's a fair criticism of the British Empire that the British Empire will, the minute you leave the shores of Britain, that's great, we're going to use you, but we don't really care about your interests. It's one of the complaints Americans had. It's one of the complaints that why Dominion is a movement in Canada, because the minute you leave, the British don't really care about you. They don't care about Rhodesians. They don't care about South Africans now. And so the populations that go out realize, well, it's better if we're on our own. And the international system that starts to develop after the First World War, they realize we're better off if we're independent and not federated. But the Milner Group accepts this. They accept that the federation isn't going to happen. And so they start talking about ever closer union through cultural, legal, trade agreements that are not anything about like top-down oversight, but interlinking and drawing closer together. And what happens with the Anglos is a model for what could happen with the other peoples. So, yeah.
Sensible Zoomer asks, do you think there's any going back on the WQ after the liberation into the workforce, etc.?
One would hope that the right sort of economic collapse would solve that, right? Like, if it's like, honey, we can't pay, someone told me they pay like, I can't remember whether it was an English person or an American or a Canadian. They were like, yeah, I pay $1,600 or $1,600 whatever currency a month for childcare. And I was like,
yeah.
What? You know? No. My brother said to me the best thing that happened for his wallet was when he didn't have to pay for daycare anymore. And when he could send his kids to Catholic school. My brother's not Catholic, but he was like, yeah, it was a lot cheaper sending them to Catholic school than sending them to daycare.
Yeah. I mean, after taxes and then after transportation costs and all of these other things, it doesn't really add up to that much,
Yeah.
For the women to go to work.
There was this show over here I remember watching, which was like one of these like some daytime TV shows, and it was like, oh, help us fix our budget. And this guy went round, I can't even remember if it was a guy or a woman, but like the financial expert came around, and they were like, right, your wife goes to work, she makes, not a lot of money. She's making like £20,000, blah, 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 blah. And it was like, at the end of the year, the family was £50 better off for having her worked instead of having her stay home. So, the right sort of economic conditions, the right maybe like AI conditions, will hopefully encourage women to not. The right cultural conditions, the right religious conditions, they might solve the WQ. What you don't want. Never mind. I was gonna make a joke that Sensible Zoomer might have gotten, but I don't want to make that joke, and I think he knows who it's about. But yeah. Anyway, yeah. So, gonna speed things up a bit here. Versailles isn't really interesting. Again, I mean, it's sort of the diplomatic, the really interesting side of diplomacy happens at Versailles, not really at the war. They put together this treaty system that is a pretty big, ends up being a failure, as we all know. It's why we got the Second World War. The idealism of Woodrow Wilson and the Americans, combined with the French bloodlust and then the English and Americans not wanting to really commit themselves too much, creates a really bad set of circumstances for the treaty system. You have this promise of democracy, some sort of like Congress of the Nations coming together, and they're gonna all agree to solve something. There's like 32 allied powers, and they were all gonna like come together, and the Americans and the British and the French and the Italians realize that's not gonna work. If we just like let 32, nothing's gonna get solved. They all have different interests, and so this like council of, it's called the Council of 10. It's the U.S., the U.K., France, Italy, and Japan, because Japan is an allied power. People forget that, right? There's this interesting story about at the beginning of the First World War, German crowd. There's a rumor that goes around Berlin that the Japanese have like taken some British islands already, and they go out and they're like cheering for Japan outside the Japanese embassy, and the Japanese ambassador has to kind of go, "Oh, please go home. We don't know what's going on." And then like a week later, Japan enters the war against the Germans, and what do? They snap up all the German Pacific islands, because there's a few of them, right? Like Fiji's one, although I think the New Zealanders end up getting that, or Australians get that. Oh, no, I don't know, but like they get a number of these like little islands that they have before the Second World War. They got from Germany. So they have the Council of 10. There's 5 countries there, but each country is represented by their president or prime minister and their foreign secretary. So there's 10 guys on the council. Japan kind of drifts away. They're not too bothered about questions that happen in Central Europe, so it sort of becomes 4. But what happens is these 4 or 5 countries basically get together and divide up everything, how it's going to go, because they can't go to these 32 countries. So negotiations are done in secret, and bankers are heavily involved in the financial side. Germany gets handed this sort of like list of demands. As I said, French want blood. The French really want to cripple Germany. The US and UK think that's not going to make anything work. We should be gentler to the Germans, and they'll be happier. Because of this sort of wobble in between, they both end up producing what no one wanted, which was the Second World War. If they had gone full throttle on the French and just gone like, yeah, let's just wreck the Germans, they could have wrecked the Germans. If they'd been conciliatory along the lines of the Anglos, they could have had a sustainable peace. But they don't get that. In large part because of the system that they're promised to is I skipped 2 points here. The system they're promised is Wilson's 14 points, which are very generous. That like there's going to be self-determination, that sort of stuff, and that there was some sort of like idea that there's going to be like a negotiation process. It's of some sort at Versailles. They arrive and they're basically handed a bill and the war guilt clause, and it kind of goes against everything that Wilson said they were going to do. It goes against. They're sort of, they lost and they kind of had to eat this, and it was misrepresented to them how it was going to happen. So, and then the other problem is America does not want to commit itself. The British are not overly enthusiastic about committing themselves, but they're sort of entertaining the idea of like, yeah, we'll probably come and help France. But the other thing is, if France goes into Germany and wrecks Germany, guess who's going to be the most powerful country on the continent? France. And what has Britain been dealing with for hundreds of years? A European theater where France is the most powerful country on the continent. Britain is no more interested in seeing France dominate the continent than Germany. And what British want is an even balance between the two. So they're not too interested in helping the French, but they kind of will. Well, okay, fine. The problem is America gives this very idealistic system and then abandons it. So Woodrow Wilson really just messes everything up. And who is really heavily involved at Versailles? Philip Kerr, who, besides Lionel Curtis, is probably one of the most important figures in the Milner Group. Philip Kerr dies in 1940 unexpectedly when he's ambassador to Washington, trying to get the Americans. The Americans are already on side, but cooperating in in the pre-American involvement of the war, the build-up, that sort of stuff. That's why he's sent there to make that happen. You see fragmentation in Europe. Austria is a really weird one because the Austro-Hungarian Empire falls. Germany has to pay a bill. Austria doesn't have to pay anything, even though it started with the assassination of the Archduke. Why does Austria not have to pay anything? Because the Austrians argue No, 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 no. Austria didn't do that. That was the Austro-Hungarian Empire, not Austria. We're not the last bit of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. We are a new thing that's come out of it. And they have a really weird event, which I have never seen anywhere else in history, in which they're a country that wants to join another country, but they're not allowed to, because of course they want to join Germany. And in fact, what they want to call themselves is the German Austria. That's what they want to call themselves. And the allies at Versailles go, no, you can't name yourself that. You have to name yourself the Republic of Austria. So that's weird. Turkey breaks up. Technically, the First World War doesn't end until 1922 with the Treaty of Lausanne, which is a treaty signed with Turkey because there's still some stuff going on between Turkey and Greece. And so, yep, ends there. Eastern Europe and Central Europe, the system falls apart. Poland emerges between Russia and Germany and Austro-Hungary. The East Prussia's cut off from Germany. The Polish are given this corridor to the sea. Danzig, which is a German city, it's now Gdansk, is not given to the Poles, but the Germans aren't allowed to keep it either. It becomes a free city under the League of Nations Protectorate, but no one is really protecting it. Poland fights with practically all of its neighbors. It destroys the Soviet army in trying to invade it. It fights with Lithuania. It fights with, I think, the Czechs and the Romanians, and it fights with everybody. Yugoslavia is created. And there's this back and forth between Yugoslavia and Italy. And this is interesting because what happens is Yugoslavia, there's some issue around the city of Friom. I can't remember how to say it, but it's something like that. It's the city where Annunzio, the sort of proto-fascist, begins. And it's an Italian city surrounded by Slovenian countryside. So the people in the city are Italian, and all the countryside, all the villages and stuff around are Slovenian. And they are, Woodrow Wilson, imagine my surprise. American idealism and Woodrow Wilson mess things up again. Because Woodrow Wilson goes, come on, we got to give that city to Slovenia. And the Italian delegation they go, no, you can't give that city to Slovenia. I just wanted to do an Italian accent. I wanted to piss the Italians off this episode. No, I didn't. But the Italian delegation refuses. Woodrow Wilson then does this stupid thing where he goes, all right, I'm not going to deal with you. And he writes this letter to the Italian people. And he goes, come on, you're better than this. Don't be nationalistic. And the Italian delegation is so outraged by this, which it was a stupid thing for Wilson to have done. They leave. They sort of boycott it for a bit. Now, what happens? They lose what they wanted, but they also lose the division of the colonies. And so they don't get any possessions in Africa from Germany or from the Ottomans. And what happens? Well, Mussolini comes and rises and becomes, El Duce. And when he attacks Ethiopia, he cites that. One of the justifications, in fact, the biggest justification for the Italian attack on Ethiopia is because you guys stabbed us in the back over the division of colonies because you did it when we weren't there, and you didn't give us anything either. There's an interesting ripple there, right? Now you think about that one ripple, and you apply that to everything. The all the ripples that happen around around Versailles, they just keep going. The agreements break down their arm controls about how many planes Germany can has, how many battleships everybody can has, how many men at arms can be had. Standing armies. These all just they break down. The French in 1923, they go into the Rhineland, the Ruhr. They're there, and what that does is it tells the British, "Oh, see, you're okay. You don't need us to help you. You don't need like this." And so the French going into the Rhineland in 23 gives the British justification to take a step further back. America has a lot of cheap loans. Germany takes advantage of this, and they repay the war debt in large part with American loans. This is all before 1929. The Great Depression does not happen. Germany builds all sorts of things throughout. Apparently, this is what Quigley says. Germany's building here and there. It's building swimming pools. For some reason, Quigley points out that villages would build themselves a swimming pool off of borrowed American money. This falls apart in 1929. The repayment system is a mess, right? How Germany's going to repay all this, and they're repaying with borrowed money anyway. As I say, 1929 happens, which is what we're going to talk about next episode, and the system falls apart. You get these repayment plans, and there are two that I'm going to tell you about, which are not important in the details, but one's the Dawes Plan. And why is the Dawes Plan important? Because basically J.P. Morgan designs it. Okay, so J.P. Morgan is unambiguously involved with the international peace process and repayment of debt. So they're involved. The other one is the Young Plan, which, again, not important what the details are, but they set up the bank for international settlements, which is still going today. If you transfer... I think the SWIFT codes, if you've ever transferred money internationally, you need this thing called the SWIFT code, or an international bank account number. And that's all part of the system that develops with the Bank of International Settlements. And so Versailles doesn't work. What happens is the Americans and British end up feeling guilty about it. The French feel like it didn't go far enough. The Italians fall out. The French follow them. And the British and Americans are far enough removed that they don't really care. And so the big powers end up abandoning the thing that they designed. And this creates room for Germany to rise again. But that's a story for another episode. And that's where we are. That's where we are in about 1925. Next episode, we're going to look at the economics in more detail of 1897 and 1947. We're going to talk about managerialism and monopoly capitalism in more detail. We're going to talk about how the attempt to recreate 1913, especially the gold standard, fails, especially for the British. The British have this lost decade of chasing the gold standard. The Great Depression, and how this contributes to the Second World War. And I'm thinking about it. We might blast through a couple. There might be more to this. We might be looking at a number of chapters dealing with the setup to the Second World War. I'm not sure. It depends what after looking at stuff this weekend, how far we're going to go, but we're at least going to do chapter 7. I think we're 2 to 3 chapters away from the Second World War, so we'll have, yeah, there's at least, including the Civil War, including the Civil War, the Second World War, we've got 4 chapters there, and then I think we've got maybe 7 to 9 more episodes. So we're kind of approaching halfway point. And that's it. That's the episode done. Do you have any thoughts, Jeff? Let's see.
Yeah.
What Jeff?
Laurentian had a question regarding something to do with global capitalism, but I think that's coming up in the next episode.
I can maybe kind of shade it a little bit. If you can tell me what it was. Does Kansas producers have a market to supply?
Well, I think to expand on his question, it's kind of where does this system come out of? Where does this system where everything is produced under this one kind of global machine, where does that come out of?
Well, it was always doing that. We've always had, to some extent, a globalized economy. You had spices coming from Asia to Europe. You had Europeans taking technology to Asia. You had sugar coming across the Atlantic. You had slaves going the other way. You had rum. You had all this stuff. So, one of the principles of liberal economics is specialization of labor. I'm better at making nets, you're better at making spears. So how about, instead of making myself one spear and one net that will take me 40 hours and it'll take you 40 hours, how about I make 2 spears and only spend 20 hours making 2 spears, and you make 2 nets, and that'll only take you 20 hours. And then we trade, and what have we done? We've eliminated the need for us to work, each of us to work 20 hours. That's always existed. What changed is the ability to spread specialization around the world, to transport it in the form of goods and services at a much faster, wider way. So that you can now economically, there's this amazing fact that fish caught in Scotland, it is cheaper to freeze the fish and ship them to China, unfreeze them, have the Chinese gut them, refreeze the fish, ship them back to Scotland, and sell them in Scotland. Wow. That is cheaper than having them gutted in Scotland fresh. You want to see another version of this? I mean, it's maybe the only good thing Barack Obama ever did was An American Factory on Netflix, which is really interesting about the Chinese coming and buying a glass factory in America, and the high performing American employees get this trip to China, and one of the guys is staring. He's like, I don't believe this. Because there's this pile of broken glass at this Chinese factory, and there are just people standing on the pile of broken glass, hand picking it, because it's cheaper to pay a Chinese person nothing to hand pick and hand sort this broken glass than any other way. But that's not what he cares about. What he cares about is the fact that, if that person slips, they're dead. Because they're standing on a pile of shards of broken glass. And there's no concern for that. So it's cheaper to do that in China than it is to the process you'd have to do that in America. So can you remind me what his question was again?
His question is
how that system emerges?
Well, that's my question.
Oh, okay.
I think his question is I think he's kind of implying that canned Zook is not really a global producer of much goods.
No, but
And
it's
so
but it's
economically, how do they?
it's centralizing part of it.
Mhm.
It's a step. It's a stepping stone. You know the way how what do you think? How do you think we're going to centralize? Do you think we're going to get 190 countries to sit at a table and all vote yes for centralization, or do you think we're going to have blocks form, and then blocks of blocks, and then blocks of meta blocks until we've got these like parallel structures of the UN on one side, and then this collection of blocks on the other, and we don't ever need to formally declare one world government, but it'll just emerge, and one day in the rearview mirror, there it will be. It will have happened, and only the crazy people will have ever been talking about it.
And you already see it in the Treaty of Versailles when 4 or 5 countries are negotiating on behalf of 32.
When
So it's just kind of that there's something natural about that as well.
a lot of those 32 though are subsidiary members of blocks that the other 4 represent. Like Canada is somewhere between the American and the British bloc, right? So it doesn't really matter what Canadians say, because the British are gonna just the Canadians will have to accept it because they've got America south of them and they're tied into the British system. Deal with it.
Sensible Zoomer also has a question. Do you believe the destruction of a generation of Europe's young men has significantly affected our future outcome?
Yeah,
For example, IQ shredding and moral decline.
Yeah.
Or is our current fate inevitable anyway?
I think there's something to that. I was thinking about that today. The sort of like the destruction of like a significant portion of the gene pool. I don't know. It's really interesting. It's a counterfactual. If the system sped up the decline of the British Empire, which it seemed, if Quigley's right about that. So let's say the British Empire was going to die sometime in the 1990s rather than the 1940s, which it effectively did, right? When India went, that was that, 1947. And okay, we hold on to Hong Kong till 1997. So there is 50 years there, but let's say it's, let's say 1997 is actually like when India leaves. Well, what are you going to do with all those guys anyway? I wonder if I was going to be really cold about it. One of the things I would speculate is that the First World War served as an autoimmune attack on preparing the way for the future. That the future system was coming. And what do you not need in a globalized world, in a world of managerialism, that sort of stuff? Well, you don't need angry young men. You don't need braggadocious nobles, right? And the nobility in Britain, the nobility have the highest rates of casualties of any class. So the idea that the nobility sat back and let poor people go and die it's demonstrably absurd. More young guys with titles died as a proportion of their class than young factory workers. So I'm not suggesting that anyone organized it. What I'm suggesting is that there's some sort of you might want to say, and you kind of can see this with the invisible hand of the market. Or with the Juvenile video, what I've called the invisible hand of power. There's some sort of emergent intellect of the system, and it might be that the First World War is a useful sort of immune system function for this bigger system, in order to eliminate like a preponderance of cells that are going to be damaging in the next phase of life. You could say that. I don't know if you does that make sense?
I'm trying to think through it as well.
Like you know what the Gaia hypothesis is?
That'll remind me.
It's that there is an actual like intellect of the Earth, and so like the Earth realizes now that we're like some sort of disease, and as we get worse, the Earth is going to try and kill us or decline our numbers. So I'm suggesting that there might be something similar. You might want to think of it, if nothing else, conceptually. I'm not saying I believe this. I'm just saying, like, if I had to speculate, this might be one of the things. This might be something you want to say. That there's a similar sort of, like, intelligence from this globalized system that emerges. And as the globalized system emerges, the First World War is a feature, not a bug. And the feature that it does is it removes from the gene pool disagreeable men who want to fight wars, who will go and volunteer in the trenches. And who are the guys that produce? It's agreeable guys who like desk jobs and not going to Flanders and dying in the mud.
Yeah, it's also one of those chicken or the egg things.
Yeah,
right.
And there's a
it's
feedback
like, does
effect.
the death of, yeah, exactly, yeah. So, yeah, the result affects the effect. The result affects the thing that leads up to the result, and vice versa.
The cause and effect feed into each other. Yeah. So and people have talked about this, like the best young men died from Britain in the First World War, and like we're now living in this after effect of having lost the best men and their genes. Yeah, that might be something, but I don't know. I don't know enough about that, really. Yeah. I mean, I can't talk about it. I know the idea. I can't talk about it like it's. I don't know that the British are any less brave in the Second World War than they are in the First. The French are, and I don't know that the French are less brave so much as exhausted and make mistakes. The French get a bad rap in the Second World War. De Gaulle fights all the way, and he doesn't just start fighting once he gets to England. In his time in England, one of the reasons why he can call himself president after the fall of France and why the French tolerate him the Free French tolerate him calling himself president is because his division, I think it was a division that he had command over, was like the one that like fought all the way. So the French know Germany presents a threat. They're prepared to fight. The Germans are prepared to fight. The Germans lose men just as much as the British lose men. And the Germans are prepared to go and tear Russia in half 20 years later. So I don't know. I lean in towards like we emphasize nurture too much. Nature's part of it. But nurture's an element too, in that like the vacuum will be filled by someone. If you're out of 10, your bravery's a 6. Well, yeah, when something needs to get done and there's a guy with bravery levels at 8, you'll stand back and let him do it. But when 6 is the highest number and it has to get done, you're either the 6s are going to stand up or the society is going to collapse, right? And we haven't collapsed yet, not in that way. And Yeah, so it's a good question. It's more something to like ponder. I think the effect that it had. You might be able to find studies that look at it, but yeah. And I haven't. One of the things I haven't talked about is the spiritual and cultural decline that comes out of this. We can talk about that more. But that the more I read about that, the more I really do agree with Quigley that the First World War didn't do anything new. People did not abandon church because of the First World War. Maybe that sped it up, but people were already abandoning church. The religion was already in decline in England before the First World War. And you can see that with the rise of these non-creedal groups, the non-conformist groups, which were already in abundance, and weirdly had already peaked and were now declining before the First World War even began. So the extent to which you can blame the First World War for things is debatable. In fact, you could go the other way around. These trends probably caused the First World War rather than the First World War causing them.
All right.
All right, cool. Thank you guys, and hopefully this time next week. I'm pretty. I think we can do this time next week, but we'll let you know. And watch the shorts. Watch the shorts. And tell your friends. And Sensible Zoomer can send me a large super chat. All right.
And a lot of the shorts are designed to be shared as well on social media.
Yeah. And share this too. Or.
All right.
And if Laurentian wants to write up some agricultural questions or comments, we'll read them out at the beginning of the next show. All right, thank you guys. It's good night from me. Go on, Jeff. You don't know that cue? Or is Jeff already gone?
No. Is this a late 80s pop culture reference?
No, it's like a British TV show where I can't... Is it
okay.
The two Ronnies or something like that? It's good night from me, and then the other one goes, and it's good night from me, and then good night.
All right. Good night.
Yeah, good night.